I know what you're thinking.
This might be some new form of Russian propaganda.
You ever get that sinking feeling? You know, the one that you feel you've only heard maybe half the story? Or even a different story altogether? Hello and welcome to the Red Pill Diary. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, let's flip the switch, shed some light on it. The well-dressed, gray-haired, middle-aged man fumbled with his keys following a night of high-stakes planning and some illegal, well, for others, drinking. At 57, he could still hold his own. In the last few months, that was a whirlwind. But the real work was Chicago. Now there was success. His plan was brilliant, even the quick changes on the fly. He was used to making fast decisions and calculations in business, some of which cut very hard. But that's the way it had to be sometimes. And he wasn't soft, because that could get you hurt or worse. He did what was needed, and fortune had always treated him well. If a businessman couldn't handle the heat, he thought they shouldn't be in the game. It was like cards. Deal with the hand that you have. And boy, did he have a great hand. Well, except for the one card. She was feisty but shrewd. It was a slight alteration in his plan, but it was fixable. He had his way and needed some time, but he wanted and needed to obtain the prize. Then he'd make it right. She was significantly younger, but just as cunning and had a temper. He had kept her involved in all of his deals, taking copious notes and working the crowd. They had been in work together for over a decade, but weren't officially married. But that was due to his current wife's unwillingness to give him a divorce. But he couldn't blame her, considering he was a well-propertied man. There was enough to go around, and now there would be much, much more. Chicago had gone well, money well spent. The bed was soft, and he relaxed and began to drift. He felt the soft hand on the forehead, or he felt the sharp pain. He staggered to the hospital with a fatal wound, and she ran. Like most crimes, it's always the one thing not planned which creates the butterfly effect. It was November 26th, 1920. So let's set the stage for this episode. You know, we're in the 1920s, but we have to go back to the turn of the century because there was a lot of social changes began in response to the previous era, which was known as the Gilded Age, and that was between 1870 and 1900. You know, at the turn of the century, progressivism and conservationism began at the end of the 19th century with Teddy Roosevelt. Both were the defining marks of the Wilson administration. It was the growth of the administrative agencies in those administrations and in progressivism, and with the conservation movement. Industries were filled with experts, and they wanted more control of the government to stamp out corruption and abuses they saw from the Gilded Age. America also saw the Third Great Awakening and the advancement of the social gospel, the effects of social Darwinism, eugenics, and the influence of Karl Marx and the Red Scare. This is also the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. So between this time, 1900 and 1920s, America was drawn also, quite possibly willingly, into World War I, ending with the failure of the League of Nations to be ratified by the Senate in the United States. Also, what we saw was a feeble President Wilson, incapacitated by a severe stroke. The severity of his condition was concealed by his inner circle and his spouse for the last part of his presidency, a little over a year. Wilson's illness affected his personality in various ways. It made him prone to disorders of emotion, impaired impulse control, and defective judgment. Now remember, the 25th Amendment was not available until February 10, 1967. So only a handful of people and the First Lady determined what documents the president read and who was allowed to even communicate with him. No one in his cabinet wanted him removed, despite some Republicans who publicly stated otherwise. Some have described Edith Wilson as the first female president of the United States for her influence in administration. Now let's stop. As we set the stage going into the 1920s, does that event with the Wilson administration resonate? Because the conduct you see right there, and history and historians have blatantly stated this is what was occurring. Think about what's going on right now. Regardless of your political position, look at the person that's supposed to be in control. Now, I keep saying that history rhymes. You should take the honest position of, is there really an issue here? And is this repeating itself just like it did with Roosevelt? These changes formed the setting in America for this episode and others. Whether these instances were spurred organically or not in response to industrial and scientific developments of the age. The 20s, the Roaring 20s, also known as the Jazz Age, and it was as the French call it, année folle, or the crazy years. So this decade may have begun with a roar, but political change and financial powers, they don't go into the night quietly. Like a chameleon, it just adapts. Now let's jump forward to the Republican convention in Chicago for the election of 1920. Like most conventions and their proceedings in a day, it has its stars and its dark horses. You know, the ones that they don't expect to get the nomination. But Jake Hammond, known as the Oil King of Oklahoma, had his money, $1 million. Now this is $1 million in 1920. Secured with a loan against his oil company shares with National City Bank. And we'll get to that bank again in future episodes. And he had his money on this dark horse as a winner. Why? Because Jake was an astute risk taker with a goal. He understood how politics worked, and he understood how the convention played. He started early, incentivizing success, which generally called for money, lots of it, spread all around. Now let's just stop here for a moment. This is an election year, just like it was in 1920. Notice who the power brokers are. It's the campaign managers who are running and trying to get the right people involved. Don't think that money doesn't change hands today and that the trade-off for positions doesn't occur today. They may not say them out loud, but look who ends up filling the cabinet spots and what role they played in the actual election process. You can assume that to some extent this is still going on. Remember, chameleons just changed colors. What happened in 1920? Some of that's still going on, even in 2024. And you can bet your dollar on that one. And Hammond had bet his dollar on Warren Harding, an interesting character. The editor of a local newspaper, a former senator from Ohio with a circle of friends called the Ohio Gang. Now, this group were directly or indirectly involved in some real shady business dealings. Remember, this is the era of prohibition. Yet, the one thing, they were loyal. And if you're a person in the middle of this type of business, what you need around you is loyalty. And they were not shy about getting their hands dirty in a catch-as-catch-can endeavor. They were familiar with the Omerta culture, and they were aligned with Harding, the dark horse. Harding had some skeletons of his own in the closets which were useful for the people that were getting him ready to be nominated. He had a wandering moral compass. Along with cards, alcohol, cigars, there were women, other women than his spouse. There was Carrie Phillips and Ann Britton, the latter with whom he had fathered a child. Now, why is this moral compass stuff important? Remember James Madison's words in Federalist number 51? Remember what he said? Government is basically the greatest reflection of all human nature. And if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, clearly right here, we don't have angels, neither in the dark horse or neither in the people that are his circle. And what did Lord Acton say? Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then he goes on to say, great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority, like now with these individuals at this convention, and still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. Take a look at what's going on, and what do you think history has shown about when people get into the position of authority and power in the government? That's why this is important, and it also reveals what we're seeing today manifesting itself out through the news media, whether they like to have to report it or not. But in social media circles, you can pick up information about what's going on and look, and lo and behold, what do you see? Just what they saw. Despite the meandering morals, Harding's campaign manager and Mephisto, Harry Daugherty, along with Jake Hammond's money and their combined influence, and a closed, smoke-filled backroom meeting, secured the votes for the nomination of their dark horse, who wasn't an angel and could be worked. And guess what? Harding won the White House in 1920. Harding had actually planned to make Jake Hammond the most powerful businessman in America. Harding promised him a wealthy oil man the Secretary of Interior, and the control of leasing the government lands. But Mrs. Harding, and some had called her the Duchess, she had one condition. The married man, that'd be Jake Hammond, had to end his affair with Clara, his longtime mistress. But we know how that turned out. Enter the senator of a newly formed state of New Mexico, Albert Fall. What did he have his eye on? Three Rivers Ranch. He was waiting for it to go up for sale, and he was friends with two prominent oil tycoons. So what was the prize that Hammond sought, and the one that Albert Fall stepped into? It was the position of the Secretary of Interior. Why? Because the Secretary of Interior had control over government property and leases. Why is that important? Because there were two fields that were the wealthiest oil fields in the world at that time: Teapot Dome and Salt Creek oil reserves, both in Wyoming. Teapot Dome was a government-owned naval reserve, whereas Salt Creek was owned by the government and entirely under the control of the Interior. Now to put this plan into effect and put the Ohio gang to work. Harry Daugherty became the Attorney General. Albert Fall was the Secretary of Interior. Charles Forbes was the Director of Veterans Bureau, and Edwin Denby was the Secretary of the Navy. William Burns then became the Director of the Bureau of Investigation, later to be called the FBI, with Gaston Means as the central investigator for the Bureau. They had the players in place, and Fall wasted no time. Now the oil tycoons got to work. Extravagant travel and grift followed. All they wanted was an exclusive lease to extract the potential 400 million barrels from the reserve. They expected a $1 profit per barrel, or about $400 million after the kickback to Fall. That's a lot of money, especially in 1920. In today's money, that's $6.5 billion profit. So to incentivize Fall, they gave him a small loan of $100,000. That's about $1.6 million today. And they gave it to him in Liberty bonds. All Fall had to do was get control of Teapot Dome. That was not a problem. All the players and a friendly president were in place. The Secretary of the Navy was good with the transfer. And what's even better? Everybody was good with it, and no one knew what they were doing. This was a great deal. Just what Jake Hammond had expected. Now, what was the one thing that Jake Hammond didn't expect? That was Clara's reaction. And what thing do you think everybody that's working to get these leases didn't think would happen? Remember when I talked about a couple episodes ago about the professor in law school who said pigs get fatter, but hogs get slaughtered? Well, these hogs were getting fatter, and the pigs were squealing because they weren't getting any. Enter oil tycoons, two different ones. Standard Oil, represented by Robert Stewart, and this is Standard Oil of Indiana, one of those corporations that was split off the Standard Oil Rockefeller oil monopoly from 1911, and Henry Blackmer, who had several partners from Colorado. You know what? They wanted a piece of the action, and they believed that the no-bid contract was unfair. Despite their immense wealth, they also wanted to be involved in the Teapot Dome. Alarms went off, and they alerted their friendly politician friend in Wyoming, who in turn notified the local newspaper. And you had those pesky conservationists who wanted to save oil, and to the Westerner, that was such a waste. And what happened? One of the greatest scandals of the 20th century would begin to unravel. Years of congressional investigation, lies, cover-ups, contempt charges, refusals to appear before Congress, avoiding testimony, contradictory testimony, trials, criminal proceedings, and at the end, two very important Supreme Court decisions. That was not the card that any of them planned. And what happened? The American people got a glimpse of the underbelly of corrupt government. Let's stop here for a minute. The point of all of this true event that happened in 1920s, 1924, before the great crash of 1929, was an opportunity to ask yourself, look at government today. What glimpse do we see? What's unraveling in front of us today? Think about the corruption that you see. Regardless of the party and your loyalty to an individual party, what kind of corruption do you see? Every day, whether it be in social media or the sycophantic news is trying to hide stuff, we see this familiar corruption playing out in front of us. We see that we don't have angels in the government. We see that people with power are corrupted. It's not just the people we see that are vying to be president. It's everywhere, every facet of the government. And what does the government do? It is a reflection of human condition. What we see and what we expect of the people we send up there are clearly two different things. History has shown us and is continuing to show us, and we'll see this again over and over as we go through these individual periods of time, as we saw the conduct in the 1700s, 1790s, the 1820s, the 1876, and today, what do we see? We see the underbelly. We see the human condition, just what the founders had said. So when we look at what's going on today, we can see both the Wilson administration and the closeting of an seriously ill and injured president by his inner circle. We also see those issues of quid pro quo and the handling of government by individuals who go in and make $170,000 a year and turn that into tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. Despite what the news media wants to gaslight you, regardless of the fingers that are being pointed, it's happening on both sides. This is a factual event that gives you a template to look. What do you see? What happened in the Teapot Dome scandal? What happened in Watergate? What happened today? So what happened, everybody? What was the justice? Well, Secretary Albert Fall would serve a short term in prison, less than a year. He'd lose everything. Harry Sinclair, the oil tycoon, would spend 6 months in jail and re-enter the oil business, preserving and increasing his wealth. And Claire, well, she ran, of course, and was wanted fugitive that was captured, and she captured the public's interest. She was tried and acquitted only after 39 minutes of deliberations by the jury, not guilty. Reason? Self-defense. She went on to Hollywood to star in a 1921 film named Fate about her and Jay Hammond. But Hollywood banned it, and she slipped into obscurity. President Harding would die of a heart attack before the end of his first term, spared the fallout from those around him. Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, would assume the presidency for the remainder of the term. Harding's reputation would be intact for a few years. Still, history would reveal the sordid details of his hidden life and the additional scandals associated with the Ohio Gang and Edwin Forbes. Harding's promise during the election was to return to normalcy. You know, that sounds like a recent pledge where we are assured probity, transparency, and fiscal responsibility would return to Washington, D.C. and the White House. Neither was accomplished. Instead, they all caught the last train for the coast. The day the music died. I'll leave the lights on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. You know, the more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving them that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.